Underwriting support for this program is brought to you by the City of Eureka, the Victorian Seaport. Visit their website at ci.eureka.ca.gov.
Anyway, so this is the second in the series of the 3 corridor committee meetings focusing on the Eureka Arcata corridor. The first one we heard our contract NCRA engineer Dave Anderson talk about the condition of the rail prism, and this morning we're going to hear from Merritt Perry and Rob Holmlund from GHD, and this is the second part of the motion John McCowen made at our July 11th NCRA meeting, and to look at trails in that corridor in accordance with the NCRA's Rail with Trail policy. So I'd like to thank Humboldt County Public Works for Tom Matson and Hank Seaman for facilitating a lot of the background and making the presenters' work possible, and also City of Eureka for hosting and noticing. And thank you all, diverse group, for being here and engaging. We're trying to come up with some baseline pieces of information that'll be useful facts for the discussion. We've got a complicated corridor. It's wetlands, it's a rail right-of-way, it's Caltrans facilities. And
it might help if you get further away from that speaker with the microphone. There you go, that might do it.
Caltrans has at some point an upcoming safety project. Thank you, Jan. And the more we can coordinate and synergize all the things that need to happen in that corridor, the better. So we'll see how this works. Thanks to Charles Douglas from the Humboldt Sentinel for recording these. And so Bill Kier is going to walk around with a mic for the speakers to, I think we can hear in this room, but if it turns out to be too disruptive, we'll can that, but we'll try that because it will help the recording. So thank you all for being here, and now I'll hand it over to Merritt Perry.
Thank you, Clif. If anybody can't hear me, I'm going to hold this microphone kind of low, but I'd be happy to lift it up if it's not loud enough. Whoa. Should we turn that one off?
I did.
So my name is Merritt Perry. I'm a civil engineer. I work with GHD, formerly Winsler and Kelly. And this is Robert Holmlund. He had a lot to do with helping me put this presentation together. And we worked on a number of rail with trail projects together, and each one that I've done and had experience on, Rob has also been there. I also wanted to acknowledge Karen Deemer. She's in the audience today, working on a project for the City of Arcata, the rail with trail connectivity project. She working with Karen, she's really kind of carrying the torch on her project that the city has, which is really going to set an example for a lot of the other projects, and provided some of the useful data that we're relying on for this presentation today. So a little bit about qualifications. I'm a registered civil engineer and project manager with over 15 years of experience, primarily working in Humboldt County. I have an emphasis in transportation and construction management. I'm a member of the Humboldt County Association of Governments Technical Advisory Committee, and so I'm familiar with some of the programming and other transportation-related issues that are going on in the county. I've also worked on the planning and design of several rail with trail projects within the NCRA right-of-way in Eureka, Arcata, Ukiah, Mendocino County, and Willits. I've had the opportunity to walk a number of these projects and had great participation from John Williams. I don't know if you recognize him from behind, but that's him on the right and me in the middle. And that's Steve Ford with Mendocino County on the left. But John has been great in walking all of these projects and really providing his feedback as to what he would want to see if something in fact did happen for a rail with trail project. And his input has been invaluable because it allows a project to be developed without having to do it multiple times. Designing a project without operator input and then going back to the drawing board once they give you their comments would be a difficult and costly thing to do. And this is, just areas outside of Humboldt County, we looked at railroad trail in Ukiah. That's Ben Kagiyama, project manager with the city of Ukiah. And then here's a picture of a portion of a railroad trail project. We're considering doing railroad trail with the city of Arcata through Shea Park, and actually this is a segment where we deviated because the impacts to Jolly Giant Creek, which is on your left-hand side, would have been too much. But again, the city of Arcata's project offered a great learning experience and to really get immersed in the railroad trail projects and provides a background for a lot of information you'll see today. And I've also worked on a number of bike and ped. This is just a safe route to school safety improvement project in Rio Dell. And then I've worked on a number of construction projects. This is an example of a prefabricated bridge we did in Cedar Creek, where they can help you avoid impacts by having a bridge manufactured offsite and bringing them and setting those in. Those could come into play into this project and are proposed in some of the crossing locations between Arcata and Eureka. And then again, we made a lot of estimates for this project, but some things for sure, when and if a railroad trail project is implemented, it's going to be based on a lot of input from the stakeholders and regulatory agencies. And so I just recognize that we did make a lot of assumptions, and I'll go through those today. And again, it's likely to change. If the outcome is not going to be exactly what we present today on any of these maps or the estimate. It will be different. It's likely it could be the same, but it probably won't be. So, summary of our scope. We have a really short timeline and a lot of budget relative to what you normally see on a project. So I'm going to run through the items that the county asked us to do for the NCRA subcommittee. First one is to subdivide the project area into logical segments, identify design standards and typical cross sections, and identify significant constraints, major capital improvement needs, and key areas of uncertainty in each segment, provide maps depicting the corridor segments, identify areas that may require deviations from the NCRA's railroad trail guidelines, develop planning level cost estimates for railroad trail projects in each segment, including design engineering, permitting, environmental review, construction, mitigation, contingencies, and construction management. And then identify opportunities to consider design alternatives for cost reduction of environmental impacts, and provide recommendations for next steps. A lot of these components are really what you would see in a feasibility study. And again, this is a very limited scope, and so it's a challenge to dive into those in depth, but we really did the best we could to get as much detailed information as we could. So design standards, there's a lot of design standards that apply to railroad trail projects, ranging from the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, state and federal, AASHTO design guide for the design of bikeway facilities, ADA standards, railroad trail lessons learned, and other guidance documents. Specifically, the NCRA railroad trail guidelines are one that we were asked to look at and point out any deviations. Those were introduced, I believe, in 2009 or adopted in 2009. And they basically state that the displacement of tracks or sidings should be avoided, and the easement needs to be obtained from the NCRA. A feasibility study is required that looks at alternatives for developing a railroad trail project in the NCRA right-of-way, including at least one alternative that isn't on the rail, within the rail right-of-way. A development of a safety plan, and complying with the design standards, some of which I showed you in the previous sign, and also incorporating best practices such as are in the railroad trail lesson learned documents, using existing at-grade crossings and not adding new at-grade crossings, and then providing fencing between the trail and the railroad, and also providing lighting where it's needed for safety or security. And that's just a brief summary of the requirements. There's many more, and it's a several-page document. If anybody wants to look at it, I do have a copy with me. Here's an example of a railroad trail and a kind of a graphic showing what some of the primary requirements are with regard to the geometry. You can see on the left is a trail with some bikers, and this is what a typical entrance might look like. And there's a fence, which is a barrier. But there's a requirement to have separation to the nearest barrier at the edge of the trail of 8.5 feet on straight sections, or 9.5 feet on tangents on curved sections. And that's an area to keep people safe and then stay away from the train and not interfere with the train.
That's from the center line of the
That's from the
rail.
center line of the tracks, yeah. And then this graphic shows a biker on a railroad trail project, and also depicts some of the the standards for the design of bikeways, including the addition of 2-foot shoulders, and then having really, you want a minimum of 10-foot width. You can go to 8-foot where you have obstructions, but typically you like to see a 10-foot width with the 2-foot shoulders. If you didn't have the 2-foot shoulders, people wouldn't use the whole trail because they wouldn't feel comfortable riding right up next to the fence. And again, you can see the approximate setback from the center line. Again, that's a minimum setback that has to be met to any obstructions adjacent to the railroad. So just quickly, some examples of railroad trail projects. This is a spring water trail in Portland, and it's been up and functioning for a long time, and it was actually, there's pictures of it in the 2007 feasibility study. Here's another one I thought was kind of interesting that shows a boardwalk adjacent to what appears to be a Class 1 trail. Interesting to note, it looks like this trail might even be constructed on some type of sheet piling, which is one of the things I'll be talking about with some of the typical sections I'll explain later. Here's another project. This one's in Minnesota. This is what I can see a portion of it going through Shea Park and Arcata possibly looking like.
Split rail fence.
Yeah, as far as the fencing goes, there's the NCRA rail trail guidelines do allow for a rail type fence, and that's another reason why this photo is interesting. You can see what that might look like. And here's just one more of looks a more urban railway trail with a greater separation from the railroad. So defining the study area, the county really defined the study area. Originally, when we got involved, we thought it was just going to be from Arcata to Eureka, and then when we got our contract, I recognized that it went all the way from Eureka to Arcata to Manila to Samoa, and was quite a bit larger than we originally anticipated. But I'll explain some of the uncertainties. There's been a number of studies on the portion between Arcata and Eureka, less so from Arcata to Manila and Manila to Samoa. So there's a little more uncertainty, and you'll see as I get into some of the estimate later, we provide higher percentages for contingencies based on that uncertainty. Here you can see the cities, the population centers, Arcata, Manila, Samoa, and Eureka. The start of the project, what we're considering the start of the project is here, right about X Street, where the Blue Ox Millworks are, and then ending here at Samoa. And then a couple of other points of interest, which you'll hear referenced throughout the presentation, are our break cut. That's where the mill yard formerly was, and I think it's resale lumber right now. Indianola Cutoff, or Indianola right here, where I guess that's the old state feeder and cash and carry is, and then the California Redwood Company, formerly Simpson. So past studies in the project area, there are a lot of them. Emily Sinkhorn sent this list over to the committee, and I don't expect you to read this. I wouldn't even try, but there's a couple of pages, and there's a lot of studies. And when we first saw this, I think the reaction was, no wonder people want to see something built here. There's been so many studies, and why can't something be built with that many studies? But my point, there's 4 main studies that we looked at during the completion of this work.
Pardon me, Merritt.
Yeah.
Do you actually have a copy of all those?
I don't. I have some of them. I would ask. I would ask Emily. I don't know if she's here somewhere, but I bet Emily would probably be a good starting point. RCAA produced a lot of those documents. I do have some, and I think if we put our heads together, we could probably get hard copies or electronic copies of most of them. The important ones for our work on this project were the Humboldt Bay Trail feasibility study. That really was a full feasibility study looking at route alternatives between Arcata and Eureka. That was completed in 2007. Where it really stopped short, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of the county, is that there were cost estimates that really weren't comprehensive in providing detailed items. And so I think that's really what folks wanted to see is, is that a realistic cost estimate? Because the number they came up with for the preferred alternative was around 30 million. I think that's a big question that a lot of people had. Is that a real number? And so it was an important document, and we considered many of the alternatives that they looked at in there when we were making our assumptions. And so we did build somewhat off of this existing document. As I mentioned earlier, the City of Arcata Railroad Trail Connectivity Project 2010, we had the opportunity to do plans, specifications, estimates, operation plan, safety plan, and prepare the draft permits in conjunction with the City of Arcata. So again, we learned quite a bit there and used a lot of that information. The Caltrans Safety Corridor Topographic Survey Mapping, Caltrans gave us their aerial survey. So we used that aerial survey to look at the topography throughout the Eureka Arcata corridor and determine what sections represented, and determine which, where a typical cross section could be taken that would be representative of an entire reach, which I'll explain more about that in a minute, how we use those in our estimating. And also, not released, the Caltrans Highway 255 feasibility study, that played a little bit into the development of some of our next steps, particularly in some of the areas where there aren't great alternatives, consider coordination with the other agencies. And I'll talk more about that as well. So the project segments, our first task was to subdivide the project into logical segments, and I really tried to think about how each segment would be built, or what would a logical reason be to break it. And I think where you would see existing projects and in places with a destination on either end, not just some segment where it would have a break. And let me go back. So the first segment we identified is X Street, Eureka to Indianola. Segment 2, Indianola to Breacut. Segment 3, Breacut to G Street. Segment 4, G Street to Samoa Boulevard. And I'll show you some pictures of these in a second. And then segment 5, Samoa Boulevard to North Manila. And then North Manila to Southern Manila, and Southern Manila to Samoa. And you can see in the lower section, this is the first one. Here's the segment break from X Street to Indianola, X Street on the lower left. Indianola to Breacut. The reason why we selected the first stopping point at Indianola is logical. There's an interchange there now. There's proposed to be a new interchange as a part of Caltrans projects to replace those at-grade intersections. And then the next break is the next segment is from Indianola to Breacut. And the reason we chose that is because Arcata's project stops at Breacut, so this was just a natural gap to fill in a logical segment break. Next segment is Breacut to South G Street. This is a portion of the City of Arcata's project. And the reason we stopped it at South G Street is because it would be a logical stopping point. It provides, having that as a segment would be an endpoint where you could get from Eureka to Arcata and not necessarily have to continue on, but it stops at South G Street. And then from Samoa Boulevard to South G Street, that segment essentially winds through the Arcata Marsh. And then from Samoa Boulevard in Arcata to North Manila, right near Sierra Pacific Industries, and across the Mad River Slough crossing. And then from North Manila to South Manila, really this is a portion from within the population center of Manila. And then from Southern Manila to Samoa. Now I'm going to run through the estimating methodology and assumptions. And I guess this is really kind of the heart of the project in a lot of ways. But we prepared an estimate for each segment, divided by segment. We developed typical cross sections that represent similar reaches. And here's what a typical cross section looks like. In this one, you can see that the dashed line is the existing topography that either came from a ground topographic survey or from the Caltrans aerial survey. You can also see the existing railroad tracks. I'm going to refer to this as a railroad prism, which is kind of the embankment and fill and ballast that is used to support the railroad tracks. And then you can also see in bold and not dashed lines the new features that we would assume would be built in this typical section. And one of them is embankment borrow. This is an area where you put fill to raise the trail and make a flat surface, aggregate base, which would be used as a subgrade, and then asphalt paving. And you can also see, we assumed some of the typical side slopes and the 10-foot paved trail with 2-foot shoulders. And this is, a lot of the typical sections look somewhat like this. There's one that's fairly different.
There's a total of 12.
There's a total of 12. Right here on this poster, if anybody wants to look at it later and you want to say, well, what do these sections really look like? You can take a look at them here, and they're color-coded. So there's a color for each typical section, and you can see where it actually exists on this map. So anyway, we had to make a lot of assumptions for the portion between Arcata and Samoa because we didn't have any topographic data, but we did look very closely we looked at the topo, the Caltrans aerial survey to get those typical cross sections for the piece between Arcata and Eureka. So those are based on a little bit better data. And this one is probably different than all of the rest and leads to a pretty high cost when it comes to the trail development. I just wanted to show you this because I'm going to discuss it later, but this is a typical cross section that would occur in a few areas, but one of them that is one of the longer stretches is the portion along California Redwood Company where you have the eucalyptus trees. You have a fairly narrow railroad prism in that section, and then you have a large drainage ditch. Not shown here are eucalyptus trees, which are primarily over on this shoulder of the railroad. And further off to your right, it's not shown here, would be Highway 101, the guardrail, and then the highway. So, you know, there's a lot of assumptions connected with this. One, that you could fill this ditch and that there would be capacity. And again, I'll run through some of these assumptions. You could fill a portion of this ditch. And again, the sheet piling, that sheet piling would be a suitable use for doing that and could be permitted. But we felt like sheet piling would provide a conservative cost or other alternatives which might be less costly, but for the purposes of coming up with a planning level cost estimate, we wanted to have a more conservative number, so we elected to choose a typical section that included sheet piling.
And roughly how many linear feet of that configuration?
I'll show you. I'm going to run through segment by segment, and then we developed linear foot costs for each type of typical section, and so when I run through those, you'll be able to see the lengths for each type of typical section. So the next step in developing the cost estimates to identify the construction items and calculate quantities, really breaking the work into distinct construction items and figuring out how much of each of those items are actually involved with the work. And some of those would come from the typical cross sections, and others would not come from the typical cross sections, such as sheet piling, bridges, billboards, amenities, and crossings. The items that are lumped into the linear foot costs we developed for the typical section include clearing and grubbing, excavation grading, embankment, aggregate base, hot mix asphalt, and wood rail fence. And it was just a lot easier for the purpose of estimating to have a linear foot price for each one than calculating specific quantities over and over again throughout the entire project area. The next step was to estimate unit pricings using bid results, contractor quotes, estimating guides, or estimating databases. We've recently bid there's a lot of bid results that we have from projects in Humboldt County which have similar items, so where we could, we use those. Other areas, like for the sheet piling that you don't see every day, we wanted to really check that number because it has a big impact on the cost, so we looked at means estimating guides, we looked at Caltrans databases with cost and for projects of a similar size and scope. And then we also checked that with some contractor quotes. So that was, it was a big ticket item. We wanted to make sure that we had a solid reason for estimating the bid price the way we did, the unit price the way we did.
All right. Could you go back just a second to the previous slide, the unit cost?
With this one?
So yeah, so that's for 100 linear feet.
Oh, right here. Yeah. So
if nothing exceptional is going on, that'd be the cost per 100.
Yeah, and these actually correspond with typical section 1.
Okay.
So say 100 feet of a relatively simple cross section with an average amount of fill and the amount of paving. This would represent 100 linear feet.
Thank you.
As I go into the cost estimates by segment, I actually have the length of each segment and the cost per linear foot just to kind of compare which segments are more expensive to others. And then the last one is there's a number of items that we estimated as percentages. It just isn't practical to try to break them all down, and so some of the general items such as mobilization, stormwater pollution prevention, shoring, etc., we just estimated those as a percentage of the total construction cost. And similarly, we did the same for environmental permitting and mitigation. We estimated those as percentages. Although we don't have final numbers for the work we did with the City of Arcata, we did check our percentages with some of the costs for the City of Arcata project, so to make sure that they're in the ballpark. And then finally, at the end of the estimates, I have a summary with the total for each segment that we'll be able to look at, and you can have a number. The environmental portion, our assumptions for what are included in the estimate there, CEQA and NEPA documents, NEPA only if there's federal funding involved, 401 water quality certification, 404 core permit, 1600 stream alteration permit, coastal development permit, and others. Also wetland delineation, botanical surveys, biological assessment, harbor district permit, mitigation monitoring, cultural resource study, phase 1 corridor study, grading permit, encroachment permit. These are all things that would likely have to be done if you were going to build this railroad trail project, and a lot of those and all of these were completed for the City of Arcata projects. I think that's one difference you might see in this presentation. I know that David Anderson's presentation focused mostly on construction costs because he had a limited amount of time, but I think it's important when you're looking at the different estimates just to be aware that there are quite high potential for environmental costs, both for the permits, environmental documents, and mitigation.
Would there be a distinction between Dave Anderson's maintaining an existing rail structure for permitting versus building a new structure onto a rail corridor?
I think it's always easier to permit an existing project, but I don't think there would be I think each project would be looked at independently. For example, if you're going to replace a culvert, I still think they're going to look at your impacts to eelgrass or tidewater goby habitat, and they're going to look at what you're doing, and there are going to be mitigation. It's likely there would be mitigations required, and there would be additional costs. You can't go in there and do it without the steps you would normally take to permit a new project. And that's a big one. There's a huge cost to that. You're going to see some of the percentages that we estimate range from 25 to 50%, and some of the areas are just very sensitive habitats, and it's likely the mitigation could cost, half of what the construction of the trail would cost. So there's a lot of assumptions, and I caught the main ones here, and there's probably more that I'll miss, and if you want to call me on them, that's great. But the railroad, I'm going to run through the main ones, and the first one is that the railroad continue to exist to maintain prism, and that's one of the reasons we selected an alignment on the inside of the rail prism, is because it's our, the thought that the railroad will continue to be there and maintain that rather than putting the trail on the outside. And that the railroad right-of-way is continuous throughout the study area. We've heard some people with an opinion otherwise that there may be questionable areas of right-of-way, but our assumption is that it's continuous throughout the entire study area, that the railroad trail would be 10 foot wide with 2 foot shoulders, except perhaps at obstructions, that there would be slow trains, and the minimum setbacks in the railroad trail guidelines are acceptable. It was interesting here, Mr. Anderson's talk about class 1 and class 2 trains, and that it's likely any solution here for the rail would probably be one of the lower speeds and not like a class 5. And that the typical sections are representative of the project reaches, that construction access, you could use a railroad prism or the state highway for construction access. That railroad crossings would be updated when rail service resumes. For this project, because there currently is not active rail service, I don't know, we assume that it wouldn't really warrant the immediate expense to put in automated crossing gates, for example, based on preemption or something like that, because right now there is no rail service, but it has to be acknowledged that that may be a cost when rail service resumes, but those are not included in our estimates. And then placing the trail on the bay side of the tracks is not permittable. During some of the earlier consultations on the Arcata project, there was indication from the Coastal Commission that they didn't think putting the trail on the bay side of the tracks would be permittable due to coastal salt marsh impacts and impacts to roosting habitat, which they said would be very difficult to mitigate. And although they didn't participate in the stakeholder process and give us a lot of feedback, that is one piece of feedback that we did get. And that wetland and other ESHA impacts can be mitigated. There are going to be impacts to wetlands, and we're assuming that those can be mitigated. And that minimal right-of-way will be needed. It is possible that certain areas adjacent to intersection where the trail needs to go wide, there might be slight areas of additional right-of-way that are needed. And that billboards in the NCRA right-of-way can be relocated and removed. That there's adequate drainage capacity in the roadside ditches to allow partial filling in some cases. And that the narrow culverts need to be replaced, not just extended. So it would be easy to say, hey, let's just tie on to the end of one of the old culverts that goes under the NCRA right-of-way, but as a practical matter, none of them are in very good condition, so we're assuming that they'd have to be replaced in their entirety and probably not just extended. So I'm going to go through a segment-by-segment overview And at the end of each overview, I'll talk about the major features in each segment and then provide an estimate for each segment at the end. Again, the first segment is here, and that's from Eureka to the Indianola interchange. Here's a close-up view. This is a schematic, and you can see this. There's a segment map, which is over in the corner of the room. If you want to look at those segments more closely, it's there. We tried to identify most of the major features. There's a key over on that map you can look at, but this is a bridge crossing, and these are the yellow crosses are for private access crossings, and then the red with the double triangles is a culvert crossing.
Underwriting support for this program is brought to you by the City of Eureka, the Victorian Seaport. Visit their website at ci.eureka.ca.gov. So in this section, you have the Eureka Slough Bridge. There's a crossing here at this water body, which I think is called Cutoff Slough, and then 2 private crossings at for California Redwood Company. And here's one of the major considerations in this reach. This is a picture of the Eureka Slough Bridge crossing. We tried to think of a concept that would be cost effective to crossing here as a rail with trail, and this is what we came up with. Essentially, it consists of putting 2 steel girders on attaching steel I-beams to each one of the pile caps, and then coming in with prefabricated 30-foot bridge sections and setting those there. There's a draw span in the middle of that bridge, and which you could make it so the trail section at the draw, where in the draw section would actually elevate if that ever was to function to allow navigation to proceed there. And there's a couple graphics that really just help understand it. Sometimes people have a hard time looking at sketches, but you can see that's a pile cap, and the existing pile cap on the bottom. The gray is an I-beam that could be attached, and then the black represents where the precast or prefabricated bridge segment could be put in. And of course, it would have to have rails. And here's just kind of a graphic depiction of that.
Wow.
That's cool. Yeah, I guess maybe I could stay on that a little longer. But of course, it would probably be up higher and be flush with the bottom, and then you'd have rails. So it just kind of shows you how it might actually fit on there. Here's an example of where this was done. I think this is outside of Portland. It's not radically different from what we're proposing. Here's one of the other significant constraints in this section is adjacent to, as this is looking south towards the Eureka Slough Bridge. I don't think you can see the Eureka Slough Bridge, but a lot of the section, this section is unique because there's coastal salt marsh on both sides of the rail prism. Again, that's one of those very sensitive habitats that might be difficult to permit. So we assumed a typical section 3 in that section just to minimize the footprint and the impact. Again, that one of our assumptions is that some wetland impacts would be permittable, but that's one area that may be a big assumption. Again, here's an area where there's an arrow prism. This is in front of California Redwood Company with the eucalyptus trees adjacent to the state highway. We assume that those trees would have to remain. I think as part of a previous Caltrans project, I think they found that those trees needed to remain. So we're assuming the same thing. And in this section, because of the arrow prism, we assume sheet pile, which has a high cost. I'll show you in a minute. But really, that was to be conservative. And then here's looking to the south again, towards California Redwood Company. And here's a picture of what their private access would look like. So again, the significant constraints, we talked about much of these. Eureka Slough Bridge, 730 feet. It's a navigable waterway, so you'd have to probably be on one of the existing structures, at least a significant height above it. Coastal salt marsh both sides of the track, heritage eucalyptus trees adjacent to the drainage ditch, possible security concerns at California Road Company, and then there is one billboard along that section as well. The assumptions is that the railroad bridge can support the additional load. Given what the Cooper loading and the anticipated loading would be for a train, pedestrian loading would be significantly less, probably 2 to 5% of what the train loading would be. So the cantilever is probably something that is feasible and could happen. Another assumption, the coastal salt marsh impacts can be mitigated. I just stated that one a moment ago. And that
limited removal of eucalyptus trees is acceptable. There's a lot of small eucalyptus trees that have grown up and sprouted on the railroad side, which it looks like they've been maintained, although not recently. They're much smaller. We're assuming those could be removed, and maybe a few isolated trees adjacent to the ditch. And that no trailhead improvements are included in this. They're in the 2007 feasibility study. They show a trailhead connection that goes under the Eureka, Caltrans Eureka Slough crossing and goes over to, I think, what's the name of the road? Jacobs Ave, and we didn't include that in our estimate. And then we also didn't include an intersection at Indianola, and we're assuming that that would be done as part of the Caltrans at grade crossing, so we don't show costs for that interchange. Here's the cost estimate. I know this may be difficult to read, and these will be published in the final report. This is the most expensive section of all of them, and for the, if you take a look, you can see some of the percentage items at the top: mobilization, traffic control, control of water. Control of water would really be just eliminating water from the construction zone. Maybe it's blocking off the ditches or rerouting it. Erosion and stormwater pollution prevention, shoring and trench safety, and then miscellaneous trail amenities. Those could be interpretive signs or other features such as benches and things that you might have there, ballers at the entrance. But those are all estimated as a percentage. You can see that they're not a significant contributor to the overall cost. The big ones are, you can see replacing the existing culvert. We estimated each one of those as a lump sum at $200,000. Sheet piling, we estimated that separately, but there's 7,350 feet of sheet piling, and we're assuming $220 a linear foot. So that's $1.6 million for sheet piling, $1.5 million for the Eureka Slough Bridge. Relatively small cost for the private driveway crossings. And then here you can see the typical sections. I showed you typical section 1 and 3, but you can see the linear foot cost for each one of those typical sections here in the length. So for example, typical section 3, which has the sheet piling, although it's listed as a separate item, is here. And then the $131 per linear foot, and that's for primarily the earthwork and paving and fence. And then remove and locate a bollard. You'll see, so that just the base construction estimate for that work is approximately $6.2 million, and because there's pretty high uncertainty in this section, we did have topo, so it's less than some of the other sections, so we assumed a 30% contingency, and that design and surveying would be 15% of the construction costs. Environmental permitting and CEQA would be 7.5% of the construction costs. Mitigation and monitoring would be 25%, and that construction engineering would be 15%. So you can see the extensions there. So with the contingencies and other soft costs, the estimate for that reaches about $12 million or $700 per linear foot. Again, that's the most expensive section. You see how some of the costs go down for some of the other sections. The next section is Indianola to Braycut. Here's where that is on the overall segment map. Here's a close-up. There's a number, you can see the yellow circles are the private crossings. There's also a couple of culverts or bridge replacements.
That's in the next section.
That's in the next section, so there are no culvert crossings in this section. Here's a picture of what it looks like. Significant constraint that you can see is the presence of palustrine or freshwater wetlands between the highway and the railroad prism. So fairly simple, short section. The most significant constraints are that there are wetlands adjacent to the railroad prism. And our biggest assumption is that the typical sections are representative, and they are based on an aerial survey, so we expect that to be pretty close. The estimate for this section is, you'll see similar items based as a percentage at the top. We applied a value of $5,000 each of the private crossings. That could include some minor grading or paving to meet the required grades for the trail, and then some signage and striping. Again, billboards, you can see that we have a little bit lower contingency on this section because it's a little bit simpler, and then the same percentages for design and surveying, environmental permitting and CEQA, mitigation and monitoring, and construction engineering right away. And much smaller cost per linear foot, $247. So break cut to South G Street is the next segment. Here you can see the area in red. This is, again, a portion of the City of Arcata's project, and it has the highest number of crossings, I think, for any of the segments. And starting at the south, you can see the crossing here at Break Cut. This is Brainerd Slough crossing. Old Jacoby Creek, that's an existing culvert crossing. This is also an existing culvert crossing. This is Jacoby Creek Bridge, which was highlighted in David Anderson's presentation. And then Gannon Slough Bridge, and then a proposed at-grade crossing at Gannon Slough Bridge, and then a private road crossing here at the wastewater treatment plant. There are a few pictures of the segment. Here's what the private crossing looks like at Break Cut. This older picture when the mill yard was there. You can see it's a pretty simple prism, and it would be pretty easy to construct the trail. Here's one of the, on the left is the box culvert that goes under the state highway, and that's Caltrans, and on the right you can see the NCRA culverts. You can see on the culvert for scale, they're pretty big, and they're in pretty bad shape, and so again our assumption is that those would be entirely replaced, not just as extended as a part of this project. Here's looking from the north to the south where at that crossing location. Again, you can see wetlands on the left, freshwater on the left, and coastal salt marsh on the right, potential roosting out. You can also see areas where there's been erosion, and Mr. Anderson spoke about that at length too, and this is one of the areas that has a higher erosion from the bay.
When you say roosting, is that loafing habitat or roosting? Or both?
Right there is shorebird roosting habitat.
Roosting, but also loafing habitat at high tide.
I don't know the answer to that. And again, you can see the poor condition of these culverts with the bottom of them being almost gone. This is a picture of the old Jacoby Creek culvert. And again, some more of the erosion. You know, one thing to think about with these two is that these are going to be difficult to replace. I mean, you have to work, it's likely you have to work around the tide cycles, and you know, it just adds cost to these type of replacements. Here's a picture of the Jacoby Creek Bridge. I think this is, you know, when we reviewed this for the City of Arcata's project, it was our assumption that a new bridge would have to be placed here. Our first choice was to, at the time, Caltrans was planning on replacing the Jacoby Creek Bridge with the highway bridge with a 8-foot wide shoulder, and so the plans for the city's project actually show using that rather than building a new bridge in here between the railroad bridge and the highway. And here's just an example. This is a prefabricated bridge on Cedar Creek, and you know, these are great because you can just bring them in and drop them in without a lot of time on site.
Where's Cedar Creek?
How long?
Del Norte County, it's in Jed Smith State Park.
What's the max length? I think she's asking.
You know, they can, we proposed one for Gannon Slough, so they can be a couple hundred feet or more, supported 300 feet, supported by piles. An interesting thing, I've heard it from a number of people, why don't you use the old railroad corridor that's outside of the existing one? I tried to look for, this is a picture of what I think that is, and there's another area where you can actually, I think here you can see that the prism goes above grade. We didn't really look at that at all. It'd be pretty difficult to permit and build anything practically, but surprisingly a lot of people think that's a viable alternative, and I just think to try to permit like something like that would be impossible. Here's a picture of the Gannon Slough crossing, another crossing, and for the city's project, and without a planned Caltrans project, that right now there's a planned bridge a bridge to go between the existing railroad bridge and the Caltrans bridge. So there'd be new piles placed in here and then a new bridge placed in between the two. When I get to some of the opportunities for cost savings, I'll make a few points that relate to that. Another significant constraint in this section is the siding just north of Gannon Slough. When Mr. Anderson spoke, he wasn't sure of, you know, they stated that this would need to stay there and be preserved, and that's something that we did have the opportunity to talk to John Williams about in an area where his input was really invaluable, because what he actually said is, look, if we're going to operate here, we only need 1,500 feet. And the siding's much longer than that, and so what that allowed us to do is to, you know, leave the 1,500 feet and be outside of that prism where it's slightly more expensive. But then after leaving the width they need to operate, then come back and occupy the area the siding is currently in. And so that was one area that was good to have as input. This is South G Street. You can see some of the presence of wetlands and railroad prisms here. Again, some of the erosion, and be real difficult to put a trail there. A little bit easier here. We talked about these significant constraints. Assumptions: prefabricated bridges could be used to replace the culverts. Bridge placement could be done from the rail prism. 1,500-foot siding is acceptable. Assumes the Caltrans replacement of the Jacoby Creek Bridge with a separate 8-foot crossing. And I guess one of the big ones is that at-grade crossing at Gannon Slough is acceptable to CPUC and NCRA. We talked with Dave Stewart of the CPUC, and currently the city's project does show an at-grade crossing there, with the thought that if we eliminated another at-grade crossing within the city, that would be acceptable. And CPUC representative indicated they thought it would, and so taking one out and replacing it with another.
Could you go back to the previous slide? Sure. For a second.
So any questions there?
Well,
really just the significant
or maybe I can just ask the question. Sure. I think the previous one showed real large size riprap on the bay side.
Yeah.
And you know, so you're saying, well, gee, that'd be tough to permit, but actually you could do a lot of mitigation by putting in a trail there with the 2-to-1 gradient instead of what you have there. You would actually improve the bayside habitat, arguably.
So, right, co-locating a trail with a restoration of the rail project, I think that's possible. One of the difficult things is there's not a lot of at-grade crossings to cross back and forth, and although that might make sense in this section, you know, as you go further away, you might run into an area where there's not erosion. You would directly be impacting coastal salt marsh habitat, and I guess I agree with your point, but when you look at the thing in its entirety, it gets a little harder to do.
You can't switch sides of the tracks at your convenience. It would be a lot easier if you could. You have to cross where there's already a crossing.
Okay. So as far as the cost estimate, you can see the significant costs in this section. Really, the Gannon Slough Bridge is probably one of the big ones. There's also provision, you know, an overlook plan for this section. So we essentially left this like it was for the City of Arcata's project. One thing I might add is that for Arcata's project, we actually compared the surfaces and calculated the quantities using surfaces, and we compared that to what our typical sections, our quantities would be with the typical sections, and the typical sections were slightly more conservative. So we actually used those for this estimate instead of the actual quantities that we calculated using the surface models for the city's project.
Merritt, it's hard to see the length of that segment. Do you know roughly what it is?
If I'm looking at the two typical sections, I can't see the bottom. It looks like it's cut off, but about 10,000.
It's 2 miles.
So just about 10,000 feet, 2 miles. You'll also notice that we reduced the contingency because of some of the certainty, because that's been designed and there's no design and surveying costs, reduced environmental permitting and CEQA costs, and lower mitigation.
I'm sure environmental banking, mitigation banking is going to be required. Is that included in the environmental permitting and CEQA?
Mitigation and monitoring for environmentally sensitive habitat areas, so we're assuming about $800,000 for that. So South G Street to Samoa Boulevard. This is a portion that pretty much runs through the Arcata Marsh, and I think what's significant about this is that, you know, there's a lot of sensitive habitats there, and there are existing trails through the marsh, and I think that's, you know, that's ultimately what led to the city, you know, selecting an alignment that wasn't along the railroad prism, and it's an example of where, you know, the rail prism may not always be the best place, and they occupied existing walking trails and levees that could serve that purpose. Here's a picture of one of the existing trails. Here's, you can see some of the constraints. This is a rail prism. We actually planned for it to go off a City of Arcata levee and then cross the wetland further down using an elevated walkway. And then this is just south of Samoa Boulevard crossing, an area where there's actually maybe some right-of-way acquisition on some private property just adjacent to the crossing. And then the crossing itself, we assume that's not part of the estimate. I think it's currently planned as one of the City of Arcata's projects. So significant constraints. In that one, replacement of the Butcher Slough Bridge is a small pedestrian bridge within the Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary. The narrow railroad prism really led to the decision to use existing marsh trails. There's one wetland kind of at the northern end, just south of Samoa Boulevard, where a elevated boardwalk and marsh crossing would have to be used. And then there'd be some right-of-way acquisition.
Merritt, what are the right-of-way widths for all these sections? Do they vary?
They do vary. Boy, I can't remember off the top of my head. I've looked at them, but I can't. I have maps at the office. I'd be happy to tell you exactly what they are.
This one's obviously one of the narrower ones, I'm assuming, based on the need to acquire.
Well, and that's more
logistics.
Yeah, we actually had property line information for this one.
It's because of the utility cabinets crossing this, so you have to kind of go around them.
Okay.
Just south of Samoa Boulevard.
It's just a small clip space. It's not necessarily because of the right-of-way width.
Okay. It would be a nice thing to see the right-of-way widths for all these segments.
Yeah. Again, so here's a cost estimate. If you have to look at the major costs for this one, Butcher Slough Bridge has a pretty high cost. What also has other fairly high costs? And the perimeter levee crossing is what we call that elevated crossway, was over 100,000, and then just the construction of the trail sections themselves. Again, you can see lower percentages for design and surveying and permitting because a lot of that work's being completed in a lower contingency. Samoa Boulevard north to Manila. This is where we get into an area that hasn't been quite studied as much, or at least there weren't a lot of studies available. And we didn't have any topographic survey to really base our typical cross sections on, so we did our best from a field evaluation. There's a number of private crossings, the orange with the cross, and
no, those are municipal.
Excuse me, public road crossings like Jackson Ranch Road and Beach Street, some of the others, and then there's culvert crossings as well, and a bridge crossing at the Mad River Slough. Here we made an assumption on this piece. This is at Samoa Boulevard, looking towards where wing inflatables are. This area is heavily impacted by industry, and it would be very difficult to put a trail here without taking up some of the useful space. So we assumed for this portion that it would be adjacent to the highway right-of-way until it connected back to the trail. It just seems like that was such a difficult spot and it would take up so much useful ground. We assumed it would go adjacent to the state highway. So that's one area we did deviate from the rail width trail, but it's a pretty minor deviation. It gets very quickly, it gets back to the railroad prism, which looks like this, almost all the way out to Manila near Sierra Pacific Industries. And these are some more representative pictures. You can see there's probably some wetlands adjacent to there, like through most of the corridor. And one other constraint is there's utility poles, and one of our assumptions is that you wouldn't have to do any utility relocation. We didn't estimate that. We assumed that the trail would probably go on the outside, on the opposite side of the power pole, so we didn't put a cost in there for utility relocation. It's interesting to note, Caltrans hasn't released their feasibility study. I took this off the website, and it's a copy from what I think will be some of their feasibility study documents, but they are looking at different options, from widening shoulders to the addition of a non-motorized traffic path. And as we look at some of these other sections, it might be that if those projects proceed, you wouldn't want to do a railroad trail project, but you might want to piggyback onto Caltrans project. So it's good to be aware of other projects that are happening. And in fact, this is kind of what we were thinking for the portion where wing inflatables in that industrial area is now, to do something like that in that section. For estimating the cost for the Mad River Slough crossing, we assumed a similar cost to what we developed for the Eureka Slough crossing. We just did it on a pro rata basis. This bridge, I think, is 465 feet. The other one was 730, so we just took a linear foot cost from the Eureka Slough Bridge crossing to estimate this. Significant constraints, culvert crossings. There hasn't been sensitive habitats or species surveys. Mad River Slough Bridge, 475 feet. There's also a state highway crossing near Sierra Pacific. It would have to be crossed at the very end of that segment. There's several public and private road crossings, and then potential for wetlands. Our assumptions for the segment, typical sections are representative of the rail prism. We didn't have a survey that the trail would be in the railroad right-of-way, except at near wing inflatables. That the Mad River Slough Bridge can accommodate the added load, that there are no utility conflicts or relocation, and that there are no railroad at-grade crossing improvements. Again, I talked about not putting gates down where there would be a crossing for the trail specifically. And then limited improvements for the state highway crossing, and that wouldn't require design exemptions or other difficult permitting processes. And here's the estimate for that section. The highest cost being the Mad River Slough Bridge crossing, and then followed closely. The replacement of all the culverts would actually be more cumulatively. So North Manila to Southern Manila, there's this portion of the project area essentially from SPI to the south end of Manila. Here's a closer look. You can see there are a lot of, there are a couple railroad crossings and also public road crossings. I think there are a couple more private road crossings in there that we don't show. Here's a look at where the rail crosses. It's our assumption that the trail would come past Sierra Pacific and then come down and cross here where there's already an existing roadway intersection. But there would be a trail crossing the railroad here. Here's another example of what it looks like through downtown Manila. There's a really heavy vegetation. I didn't get a picture, but some of it is extremely overgrown and that you can't even see the tracks and portions of it. And other parts of it are open like this where there's public spaces and parks where it'd be quite easy. Again, you can see a narrow prism with ditches on both sides. Some of the constraints, there are a lot of residences very close to the trail, which will probably have an opinion on where and if it should go there. There's very heavy vegetation. We didn't catch a picture of it, but there's large trees over portions of the track, and then significant presence of wetlands. Assumptions that the typical sections accurately represent the prism, that the trail would be in the railroad right-of-way, and that there are no utility conflicts. Fairly low cost for this section, highest cost being a portion where there would be some sheet piling to minimize the size of the footprint, where there are some wetlands. I think and that's at the south end, or the far north end. That you can see that if you want on here. It'll be labeled typical section 3. You can see exactly where that sheet pile section would be. And then the last section would be from South Manila to Samoa, and it would cross underneath the Samoa Bridge. Here's a close-up look at the section. There are a few culvert crossings that are tidally influenced road crossings. The biggest one for this is that portions of the rail prism is really an island. There's pretty substantial wetlands on both sides through a lot, coastal salt marsh on one, and more than just a wetland ditch. Here you can see more representative photos showing the wetlands on both sides, and this is as you get closer to Samoa, looking back at the bridge. One of the culvert crossings. Portions of it, you can really see the railroad prism is just isolated, and it would probably not make sense to put a railroad trail here, but probably to co-locate it with the state highway or this frontage road. And there's a view close to the Samoa Cookhouse where it ends. I think we went through most of these assumptions already, but one of the big ones is the safety constraints. The railroad trail may not be permittable in this section, and there are viable alternatives, so it's likely as you go through the permitting process that they would force you onto the state highway or the frontage road. Again, these same assumptions have been throughout. The typical sections are representative, and the trail would be in the NCRA right away. Cost for this one, you can see there's a pretty high assumption for mitigation costs on this one, just because of heavy presence of both saltwater and freshwater wetlands, and then very high contingencies as well. So this, I think, the cost per linear foot for this section is higher than that portion from Eureka. It's a very expensive section. Estimating summary, here's the overall costs. You can see by segment. I think what's interesting, I put a cumulative total here, but we broke it down. You can see the length of each segment, which I think, Bill, you asked about earlier. rounded this off to thousands of dollars. You can see the construction costs and then all of the other costs in this column, and then the total. And interesting, if you look at, you know, X Street and Eureka to the wastewater treatment plant in Arcata, which would be the Bay Trail, the number we come up with is about 18.5 million, which is significantly less than was presented in the 2007 study.
Underwriting support for this program is brought to you by the City of Eureka, the Victorian Seaport. Visit their website at ci.eureka.ca.gov.
I think has a reasonable contingency and is based on, I think it's a pretty solid number based on the information that we have.
Say the range of that again, from where to where?
So this is a cumulative total on the right-hand side. So if you look at X Street here to Indianola, that's one segment, that'd be 12 million. Right. And then if you add the Indianola to Breakout, that'd be 13 million. So it'd be from X Street in Eureka to the wastewater treatment plant, or G Street in Arcata, and it would be approximately 18.5 million.
So to get from Arcata to Eureka.
Marcella?
Do you have any observations of why it's such a big difference from the 2007 study? Were there different designs? I know Arcata did some work that you got to take credit for, but
you know, I think when you're going on less detailed information, you have to be more conservative with your assessment, your estimate. And I think that's what they did. I don't think they went to the detail of calculating quantities. I'm not quite sure. There isn't backup in that document to say how they developed those costs, but they you know, there's a lot of lump sum items, and I think what we did differently as a part of this study is to actually calculate units and apply bid results and other estimating to get a better estimate. Tom?
And using current bid results is significantly different than 2007 bid results, because we've seen this on all projects. We're about 25 to 30% cheaper today than it was in 2007.
Yeah, good point. So construction costs have come down, and so these numbers reflect, you know, today's cost. They better reflect today's cost.
The presentation we had last week, we had the estimated cost of the rail prism. I noticed there's a lot of things that are kind of overlapping in this. Is there an estimated in that cost overlap between that estimate and your estimate?
You know, I tried to state the assumptions where we could. I think that one example of that may be the culvert crossings, like at Brainerd Slough, Old Jacoby Creek. You know, you couldn't really build a trail without doing another crossing. So although our assumptions for the rail with trail project don't include replacing it for the railroad, that's an opportunity for cost savings. So we assume a pedestrian bridge only and not a rail bridge, but if a project was done in conjunction, that's actually one of the opportunities for cost savings I'm going to go over in a minute.
It seems like a lot of the cost is permits and mitigation.
Huge. Yeah.
Now, that's where the overlap would come in, would it not?
If you were going to undertake both of those projects at the same time, I would have to think certainly you'd see some economy in permitting those together. Marcella.
Sorry. Do you happen to have an estimate of the number of acreage for the wetland mitigation is going to be required, and what ratio do you think factors into the percentage?
The city of Arcata has some numbers. Rob, you might be able to answer that, or Karen maybe a little bit better, but I don't want to put you on the spot. We did calculate those areas as a part of the city's projects. I don't have the numbers here with me today, but I think if you checked with, you could follow up with Karen later. She probably could give you that, or Rob perhaps.
Calculate what about the ratio? Is it going to be a 4-to-1 or?
We don't know yet. The permits, our work on that project included preparing the draft permits and the CEQA document, and those I don't think have been submitted yet.
We have them scheduled right now, hopefully to be out by the end of the year. So we should have the council's initial review of a mitigated neg deck, and then draft permits out to all the agencies. So we should have a good sense of that within, I'd say, 6 months.
Great.
So the total square footage of just the trail itself is 26 acres. And so if you assumed, some percentage of that being wetlands.
And that's just the Arcata project?
No, this is the whole thing. So you got total length there. I just did this with the calculator, 72,000 feet times 14 feet wide. you end up with 26 acres.
So if you assumed a quarter of that, then
So not all of that is going to be wetland impacts, but some percent, 10 to 30 or 40%.
Have you identified mitigation opportunities, sites for that level of mitigation?
there are some, but they are difficult to find around the bay, and so we haven't specifically identified mitigation sites.
But if anybody has any hidden gems, definitely call, toll free, whatever. I accept collect calls at midnight for mitigation banks.
Leave them on the doorstep.
Absolutely.
There is one hidden gem that has tremendous opportunity for possibly 3 or 4 acres. That could be salt marsh, brackish marsh, or freshwater, and be designed according to what the need is. And that includes the Braycut Marsh Wetlands Mitigation Bank, which has chunks of it that were never had the fill removed that are actually within the existing wetland mitigation bank. The original bank was only 7 acres, or 6 to 7 acres that were sold. The property is 13 acres. But there are areas that there are fill in there. There are approximately 1 acre of filled area that still has never been mitigated in any way. Additionally, with the new highway plans, the upgrade of the safety corridor, the north end of the Braycut lumberyard area, as you notice, all the clients there have been moving out because of the difficulties that will be experienced with the new interchange and the new highway upgrades. This is up to the property owner and all kinds of different things. Nobody's made any commitments on any level, including the State Coastal Conservancy in regards to the Wetlands Mitigation Bank that they own and manage. But that north chunk is a narrow little strip, and it includes another couple of acres of potential. So when I look around the bay, and I've been thinking about this for some 25 years, as we build these trails we're going to need to mitigate, where are those opportunities? Braycut is one of the most significant concentrated opportunities, because when we're trying to create these wetlands, instead of creating little quarter-acre chunks of mitigation here and there, which have limited value, if we can create a concentration of 13, 15, 17 acres of wetlands in combination, brackish, salt, and fresh, we get a lot more bang for our buck for the wildlife and the aquatic species and the rest of it. So that's the hidden gem. Yeah. And it's very significant.
Thanks, Bill.
Sure, and there's a good picture of it at the beginning.
I'll try to come back. I'd have to skip
no problem,
2 minute slides.
Yeah. Unless you can go to the computer. And
yeah, we can do that at the end. So again, just a quick summary of the significant constraints. Wetlands, a big one. We were just talking about that. This is kind of the island of the railroad prism between Manila and Samoa. Sheet piling in the area around California Redwood Company and area with eucalyptus trees. Bridges, Eureka Slough Bridge, Mad River Slough Bridge, and then the culvert replacements. Those are the biggest ticket items and major capital improvement needs. Cost savings opportunities. We really put a lot of thought to this and tried to come up with what we saw as some of the most likely opportunities for cost reduction. And some of we've already heard discussed today. But one, coordinate trail development between agencies and co-locate where possible. For example, if Caltrans is going to establish a multi-use trail between Manila and Arcata, then don't build 2 trails. I mean, I think that's a pretty simple one. Or, for example, where Caltrans had planned to replace the Jacoby Creek Bridge with an 8-foot trail, use that instead of building another bridge. Locate the trail away from the rail corridor where costs and impacts can be reduced and user experience improved. A good example of that is what Arcata decided to do through the Arcata Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary. There's existing trails, roads. Why build something on the railroad prism when you have another place that you could have a great user experience and is already an established trail? Design new structures to accommodate both rail and trail when practical. I know from David Anderson's talk a couple weeks ago that there are Jacoby Creek Bridge, for example, is planned for replacement. So if Caltrans Jacoby Creek Bridge project is not going to happen, and then it would be a relatively small additive cost to make a railroad bridge wider for a trail than building 2 structures. It would also reduce the permitting costs as indicated earlier. And then retrofit existing structures rather than build new. That was our assumption for the Mad River Slough and the Eureka Slough Bridge crossing. Again, trying to permit and build a new structure just would cost more than it would to retrofit an existing structure. And then phased implementation to prioritize projects with no safe alternatives. really, if you could look at doing the pieces first where there's no safe alternative, you know, in particular, I think about the heaviest use section or the potentially heaviest use section between Arcata and Eureka. You know, for example, would you build from, it may make sense to build from Arcata to Breakup, then through the Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary where there's already existing trails. That would allow you to put those scarce resources towards the needed segments first. And then request that the railroad consider interim use of structures during a phased implementation if not in conflict with rail service or excursion train. You know, if you have millions of dollars worth of trail to build and there's not potential conflicts, you know, perhaps it would make sense to consider using and retrofitting one of the existing bridges and using that for trail purposes if it didn't conflict with rail plans. And you know, there's a way of doing that where you wouldn't have to modify the structure. Really, you could build a timber structure that would go right over the top of the rail that could serve an interim use, and it wouldn't affect in a negative way the railroad structure. You know, it's one idea, and again, something that would have to be done in coordination with the NCRA and the other users of the rail. Recommended next steps: confirm assumptions made during estimating. We made a lot of assumptions, so those need to be checked. One of the best ways I think to do that, and I might have another bullet for that, but really as Arcata moves ahead and permits their project and they get bid results from their projects, these estimates should be updated with those real numbers to provide a more accurate cost estimate. And we're fortunate that they are moving ahead and we'll have the opportunity to do that. Continue to engage and seek input from the NCRA contract operator and CPUC during project development. Again, try to do it right the first time and get everybody in the room who has to weigh in on that decision. Otherwise, you're going to do it twice and you're going to come up with something that doesn't meet the needs of all the stakeholders. And then seek grant funding for design and permitting from Eureka to Breakup. Arcata took a big chunk out with the design of Arcata to Breakup. You know, so a logical next project would be to get closer to a real estimate would be to actually design and permit from Eureka to Breakup. And I mentioned this one earlier, review the City of Arcata permit conditions and bid results and update estimates accordingly. And then engage Caltrans and HCOG to seek to program priority projects with mutual benefit in regional transportation. We talked about some of the possibilities with 255. I know that Caltrans is currently trying to permit their at-grade intersection crossings in the safety corridor project, and you know, maybe they end up having to put a bike and ped piece in. Well, there could be some parts of that lend themselves to possibly doing some of this railroad trail project. And then complete a feasibility study between Arcata and Samoa for railroad trail. I don't know that this has been done yet. I know the State Highway, Caltrans has done their feasibility study, but no one's really looked at railroad trail. So if you were going to proceed with a railroad trail between Arcata and Manila, you would want to do more of a routing study, a more in-depth feasibility study. I mean, the amount of money and time we spent on this is very small, and we made a lot of assumptions, and so a more detailed study would probably have to be done to pursue that project. Some other important next steps, which very quickly could become the limiting factor for a project like this, a railroad trail moving forward, would be develop an MOU for trail operation and maintenance outside city jurisdictions. It's easy to look at this project and actually probably fairly easy to build it, but who's going to be responsible for it? Who's going to take care of it? And likely one agency is not going to want to do that, you know, in the absence of an identified funding source. So really figuring out who would be the what would be the logical entity, and if not one, then developing an MOU. So for example, the county, the City of Arcata or City of Eureka could have a defined share and defined roles and responsibilities in maintaining that and operating that trail. Then also, consider programmatic EIR for Bay Trail development in compliance with CEQA. Again, somebody alluded to this earlier. If you can look at doing a programmatic EIR for the whole trail, then you don't have to do a new EIR each time you're doing that, and that might be an opportunity to save time and money. And then this one, identify a long-term source of funding for trail operation and maintenance. So say you do get an MOU together, you do get the money, and you can build it. How are you going to maintain it? You know, I think there's some experience that the county has with the Hammond Trail, and Arcata has in some areas locally. But if you don't have a long-term funding source, then you're going to have tough argument to make for building and getting construction funds for a trail, and likely you would have to demonstrate that prior to getting a grant for construction. So even though they seem like they're further out and we're focusing on what would it take to build it, we need, the next step should really be thinking about who and how you're going to operate that and how you're going to pay for that, because likely it can't be built without figuring that out first. And then the last one, support programs that encourage public involvement in trail maintenance. I mean, understanding that maintaining a trail could be one of having the ability to maintain a trail could limit its development if you can't demonstrate that. Programs such as the Trail Stewards, where you can find lower cost ways of maintaining those trails and involving the public, might be part of the answer. So that's all we have. So if you have any more questions, I'd be happy to take a shot at them. Yeah.
Yeah, looking at the next steps and the recommendations on next steps, one thing that seemed to be absent is discussions with permitting agencies. There's some discussion with the City of Arcata, but there'll be a whole lot of permits that, and as you mentioned a number of times, that could really affect, this is working, but that could really affect the design and mitigation requirements and costs. And I think it would be appropriate to engage the Coastal Commission where I work, the county, City of Eureka, City of Arcata RER, Corps of Engineers, Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife, because you'll find out a lot about constraints that might affect your design, and I think it's important to get that early on before you get to the point of MOUs and grant funds committed and that sort of thing. So we'd be happy, of course, to, and we'd appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you at the appropriate time to kind of go through that, and I'd encourage you to do that with the other agencies as well.
We extended invitations during the development of the City of Arcata's project, and Karen, you might be able to speak to that more, but some agencies were willing to be involved and others weren't because they wanted to wait and see wait till they had a permit application pending. And so, for example, Fish and Game came down and they sat down and they talked about the issues that they saw being important, but I don't believe the Coastal Commission chose to participate in that stakeholder meeting and outreach process. I mean, Karen, maybe
we found some agencies were comfortable in the more public stakeholder meetings. With the Coastal Commission, we did have a sit-down kind of one-on-one meeting that we reviewed the project ahead of the design when we were sort of in the route alternative analysis phase. But it was just a mixed bag. We tried to meet with each agency individually, but then they all were also invited to sort of our smaller stakeholder meetings.
Well, I know Commission would be happy to meet with you. I'm not sure what happened with that particular part, and as I understand it, we're talking about a project that's more than just the city's segment, it's the entire North Bay, and I would, and even if you're not getting an initial response to a request, it's a good idea to really engage and try to follow up with the agencies. I just think that the information that you would gain in terms of possible constraints, other issues you'd have to deal with, would be extremely important as you plan and design the project in order to know what's really feasible, what's not, what costs are really going to be involved, what sort of mitigation requirements you're really going to have. I just really encourage you to do that at some point early on.
I completely agree. Again, it's doing it right from the beginning and not having to do it twice. I mean, to the extent agencies would be willing to participate and you can get that information and plan your project to reduce impacts or meet the goals of the regulatory agencies, I completely agree. John?
And Mr. Merrill, while you have the mic, maybe you could comment on the challenges of permitting any bayside trail. And of course, we see some cases where potentially you could actually improve habitat. So if, kind of the community thinks they would prefer a bayside trail, is that something that's at all feasible?
Well, a big part of it is looking at alternatives and fully understanding the different constraints. I think at one point you said that there's an assumption that the trail could never be located on the bay side of the railroad because of permitting issues, and I think there are extra challenges absolutely with locating on the bay side, but it isn't an absolute. I mean, I think there may be locations where that could be permissible. The big concerns for the Commission will be in trying to minimize environmental damage and reducing the total amount of fill as well as the mitigation. And
you know, part of that involves really looking at alternatives closely. I know your focus has been with the rail corridor because that's sort of defined the project, but as part of the permitting process, you know, you'll need to look a little more broadly at other alignment alternatives. You mentioned some yourself that you think would be advantageous. So I don't think it's out of the question to have some segments of trail along the bayfront, but you're quite right, in some areas that creates added challenges. In many places there's more resources, there's issues about erosion that you have to deal with that you might not perhaps if you locate it on the inboard side. But don't rule it out. I mean, that's something that could be considered in certain locations.
I guess the other feedback that we heard is, at least between Arcata and Braecut, a good section of that property is owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So impacts to sensitive species in refuge land is also really too much. I mean, I think is really what we heard. And so we were, it was more than strongly encouraged. We were told to stay between the highway and the tracks. Because again, we were looking at that entire section. I mean, in this forum, we're looking at Arcata all the way to Eureka without crossing the track. So you don't get to go for a 200-foot section, you know, along the bay and then cross over for a quarter mile and then cross back on the bay for a quarter mile. You would have to be able to make that bayfront trail the entire way. And I think the feedback we got, you know, specifically from the Coastal Commission and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not going to make it through permitting. So we took that, we really took that to heart, and we really appreciated that because we didn't want to have to try to spend the design time that it would take to really try to design that type of trail if it wasn't going to be successful.
Yeah, there could be all kinds of reasons why you might not want to locate it there. I'm just saying that it's not necessarily an absolute fact that the permitting by itself would necessarily preclude it. But you're right, there could be right-of-way crossings, sensitive species that make it really difficult in many locations.
Yeah, and, you know, for this effort here, we had about 40 hours to kind of put all of our work together, and so we, you know, I think any project going forward, if you can bring the regulatory agencies that are going to have the, you know, the strongest opinion or give the permits, I absolutely agree. I mean, that should be done if at all possible.
And we just heard at the Board of Supervisors recently the work of Alderon Laird and looking at protecting the assets around the bay and levees and how those might be repaired. Would there be any opportunity to, you know, synergy between that work and?
I would certainly think that the railroad would be interested in looking at that combined, because a lot of that prism is, you know, the closest thing to the bay. So, you know, if there's a collaborative effort to, you know, protect from sea level rise, the railroad certainly occupies a big portion around the bay, and I would think, you know, there'd be opportunities to work together. And as far as the trail goes, you know, it depends. I mean, if there are portions where you're going to relocate the trail outside and you know, that was going to act like a levee, like perhaps at the section between Gannon Slough Bridge and the wastewater treatment plant, then the trail, you know, there might be a combined project possible between the trail and protecting from sea level rise. Certainly.
I just wanted to commend both of you for, like you said, you had a limited amount of time and money, but the scope and the detail and the clarity that you presented to this is some of the best I've seen in work on this trail.
Drive by there on the way to work through this whole thing before I was ever involved. I always go, God, I can't believe they can't figure out how to design a trail in there. This is what I get for that. No, we enjoy it, and you know, we've worked on a few of these, and so it's something I enjoy, and so it's easy to work on. Thank you, Dennis.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm with the Coastal Conservancy, and we funded the study that you did between Braecut and...
Sue?
I'm Sue.
We've talked on the phone.
Yeah, a few times. The question I have as a funding agency with limited funds going forward, you know, we are interested in that area between Braecut and Eureka, but we don't have a lot of money to put towards studies, and so how can the information learned from the northern sections, strictly speaking between Arcata and Braecut, be extrapolated to that area between Braecut and Eureka as a cost-saving measure for planning?
Sharon and I have talked a little bit about that, and for other projects, you know, for example, I think it was another project which you funded, Waterfront Drive Trail through Eureka. You know, there's kind of an institutional memory you get when you're you're working on these kind of projects and you're working with the NCRA, you know, we're able to do them a lot more quickly. But I think having, you know, the feedback for the Arcata portion from, you know, particularly from G Street to Break Cut, you know, if you look at the assumptions and you look at, if you look at what was done there and the assumptions that were made, and you can prove those out after it's been bid and permitted, then you can jump a lot more quickly to what the alignments would be on the other sections. Similarly, you could tier off the trail operation and management plan and the safety plan. Those are documents that are not going to radically change from, you know, Break Cut to Indianola. So really, you could just take those documents and reproduce, you know, and adapt them to the next logical section. I mean, there will be some unique challenges, but really a lot of it is going to be doing the same work over again, and it wouldn't be as difficult to do it a second time.
Dive in there with that real quick. For that segment, one of the biggest costs was the sheet piling by the whole stretch with the eucalyptus, and also drive the corridor every day. And I pulled over the other day and got out and walked that section and started thinking about it. And there are 2 private crossings at the CRC on either end, and so those look to me like they're CPUC permitted crossings. They have the signs, and it looks like, you know, they would work. So you could actually cross the tracks on that side and be on the opposite side of the tracks for that whole segment, and theoretically reduce 1/3 of the sheet piling costs in there. That wouldn't have to be a whole new study, but it would be some, you know, there's got to be some degree of routing study involved in the preliminary design. So if you went straight to design with this, there'd still be some thoughts as to where exactly the trail is going to be, because you can save a substantial amount of construction funds by thinking about creative alternatives.
But I think the design and planning, I mean, looking, like, even just understanding, you know, what the mitigation requirements are going to be, for example, you can better budget for that, and you know, say, for example, you know what a required ratio would be, then knowing ahead of time, I mean, when all that's unknown, you really have to do your best to try to figure it out, and there's less effort doing it the second time, I guess would be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is this going to be compiled into a booklet or a report?
You know,
hard copy report?
We prepared it for the county, and we'll give them the presentation, and I can't remember what they called our exact deliverable, but I think it'll be a technical memorandum or just kind of a summary of the cost estimating approach. So it'll probably be a memo form of this presentation, and certainly would give the presentation to the county if they want to take it and adapt it.
Do you have this in electronic form that you could? Okay.
Yeah, we'd be happy. And I'd say we did the work for the county and the NCRA subcommittee, so you'd want to check with Humboldt County Department of Public Works. I'll give it to them and let them distribute it rather than me doing it.
Do you know how many billboards would need to be removed on the right-of-way that you looked at?
You know, I don't know exactly. They're all listed in each segment, but I can't remember what the total number is.
Order of magnitude of 7, I think.
Would you care to hazard a guess as to what the costs might be if you could place the bicycle route right on what is currently an abandoned rail right-of-way?
That wasn't part of our scope for this project, and we did develop some costs that we thought for a portion of it for the City of Arcata projects, but not for this one.
You wouldn't care to hazard a guess?
It's really difficult, and I can speak in terms of the Arcata project, it's really difficult to guess because it's very segment by segment specific. In a segment where you have a nice wide right-of-way, you've got the tracks even in the center, but you've got upland on the side that you're building on, you know, the cost might only be 20% more to build with a rail with trail than it would be to build on that existing prism. You take a section that same length and you're right along the bay's edge, and 100% of, you know, the prism is not wetlands, but 100% of your new trail alignment is wetlands, you're going to be doubling your cost. I mean, there are portions that it's going to be an additional $1 million probably per mile where you've got significant impacts to build adjacent to the existing rail prism. But I think, you know, in the spirit of, we've talked about these projects for decades, as the slide showed, and the hundreds of studies that have been done, and in a real interest to move forward in this community, the Coastal Conservancy stepped forward and said, we will fund real designs on rail with trail to start to implement the California Coastal Trail in this area. And that's really how we got to this point, was because we couldn't come up with, you know, a time frame really for rail restoration that we would have been, I think, as a community, comfortable waiting for. And I mean, because there's a beauty, as I think the person in the back said, about building it all together. And I love trains, and so I would love to see the trains come back. And I would love to, and I know when that kind of money comes in this area, that a train and a trail would be cheaper to environmentally permit and to construct together than they will be separately. But we have found over the last couple of decades that we're not on the same timeline. So something had to move forward, and so we're appreciative of the Conservancy really for stepping forward and saying, let's really see if we can do rail with trail.
And you know, if you were just looking at reduced costs for the bridges alone, I mean, if you didn't have to, if you could retrofit bridges, you'd save a lot, you know, millions of dollars. But we didn't go through and estimate what the cost would be.
And the environmental mitigation costs would be substantially less.
Underwriting support for this program is brought to you by the City of Eureka, the Victorian Seaport. Visit their website at ci.eureka.ca.gov.
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you for a very good study and very well presented. Really do appreciate it. I can understand that it was beyond the scope of your study to see if there was a rail coming back and what the trail would cost then. Do you have any examples of other places where that was done, like in Portland or any other place that they did rehabilitate the rail and then put a trail in, and then what the difference was? Do you have any sense of that at all?
You know, I've seen a lot of rail with trail projects, and then I looked around for, I don't have a good sense for what a combined project would be. I mean, I guess you could probably look at our costs and look what David Anderson comes up with and then assume you could save 20 or 30%. If I was going to estimate it, I'd probably do something like that and assume that, you know, reducing the cost. But if you looked at the permitting costs, you might cut those in half. I think you could probably go through and make some assumptions and probably estimate that. But
and really this very much, to me, is what we want with the rail, East-West rail feasibility study. This kind of data, you know, it'd be a lot more expensive and a lot more in detail because it's a bigger and longer route. Right. But this is the kind of information that we need. Right?
There's a document online called the Rail with Trail Lessons Learned, and then there's the Rail to Trails Conservancy. Those are two websites you can look up that can answer more of your questions.
Yeah. Okay. I know at the third meeting in this series, you're going to look at shipping and other rail uses and things like that, which will help answer some of the questions about this timeline of is the rail coming back and when and what's going to drive that return. And at the first meeting 2 weeks ago, the issue of sea level rise came up. You were mentioning Alderon presenting information to the board just the other day. And in the last 2 weeks, in investigating that further, what's been discovered is with the whole Caltrans highway plans for the upgrade of the safety corridor, they did not incorporate any considerations for sea level rise into that project. And as I understand it, it's because their notice of determination was already issued for that project before the state guidelines came into play that said you have to plan for this sea level rise. So the highway reconstruction and upgrade is not planning for the sea level rise. And I think you made the point that the railroad prism is in fact that first levee. It's the first line of defense for whatever happens. And we already know that the elevation of the current prism is such that it's washing over at high tides with storm surge and excessive freshwater runoff. So given that, I mean, I guess I'm a really strong proponent of wanting to have rails with trails for this section. And given the dilapidated nature of the existing railroad infrastructure, bridges, culverts, ties, everything, and it was presented to us by the engineer when this question was brought up that that sea level rise issue can be dealt with just maintenance, but I'm having a hard time visualizing how you raise the level of the railroad prism without picking the rails and the ties up at the same time. You can't just add gravel.
Right.
You'd bury the ties and the rails.
And your footprint would get bigger.
Yeah, and it would get bigger and you'd have to mitigate for that anyway. So just from a perspective of cost effectiveness and getting everybody on board with this project, the Rail with Trail project, where we pulled all the rails and ties, used the railroad prism to construct the trail prism on the adjacent slopes, reinforced all the armoring on the bay side, and got that prism up to 10, 11 feet, whatever it needs to be, rather than the 8.5 or so that it is. So you deal with sea level rise. You've created an infrastructure that's wholly there and in place. The railroad infrastructure is so messed up right now, it would benefit that in creating a new prism that would be so substantial, and then you can have the trail as well. And by combining those, you save all the money on environmental permitting and engineering and everything. It just, to me, and everybody in this room would probably be on board with doing rail to trail, or rail with trail, excuse me. So I mean, it just logically, we're going to have to deal with sea level rise. So at what point do we combine these projects and deal with it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the points of the committee, is looking at both of those things and kind of making a recommendation of how to go forward. Maybe that's one area to explore a little bit more, is a combined project. But again, then it comes down to project timelines and limited resources, and can you build one giant levee, or it seems like what's the driver and what's the motivator? And maybe Clif, you're better to answer that one than me. But
no, I think just talking about timelines and scopes of projects. One of the things we really wanted to do, and I just want to thank you guys for just doing, as Dennis said, a great job with a very limited time frame and scope to really identify what we know, and then a lot of the point here is to identify what we don't know and how we're going to go forward. So in that vein, 2 weeks, October 26th, here will be I'm going to get with my committee at the end of this meeting here, and we'll kind of decide how we're going to go forward. The subject is restoration of rail service. The presenters are yet to be identified. John Williams was invited by my counterpart, Bill Kier, at the Healdsburg NCRA regular meeting just last Wednesday. Unclear. I'm going to try to make some personal contact with him and see if we can get him here to talk about that. So, but anyway, we'll be here in 2 weeks at 10 a.m. Dennis.
Before we adjourn this, I wondered, at our last presentation from Dave Anderson, he was supposed to have this report available. Yeah. Is that out, and can we get access to it at the public?
I think some of that is probably a little bit challenged with the Seaman family tragedy. Hank was sort of the main point person from Public Works working with Dave. At some point, we're hoping to have all three of these presentations archived together as a report that, and I'm going to let Bill jump in here.
Yeah, I'm with you, Dennis. I made a point when we met here on the 28th of September of noting that Dave Anderson's contract required him to submit a report to County Public Works by the 5th of October, last Friday, and gave Dave a chance to say, well, it's going to be close, but I said maybe another week, which would be today. So one of us, Tom, is going to...
I haven't seen it, and when we get it and we approve of it, we'll post it on the county website.
Put it up on a county website. This is a PowerPoint, could go up on the website. That takes care of your issue about getting those numbers up.
Yes.
Again, I'm determined to get all this stuff rounded up into some kind of a database that we three will work from. There are obviously little loose ends to deal with. Dave Anderson 2 weeks ago told us that normal maintenance of the prism, were there a train operating on it, would keep pace with sea level rise. Potentially. I think Alderon Laird, I think there's a hot note in my, I just got home last night, so I haven't gone through my email, but there's one in here that says, not. Yeah. He said, that isn't going to happen. Lawrence.
All things works. on the maintenance kind of issue is what they do.
Let me get you the, the mic so we can get it on the record. Thanks.
So what they do on the road, as far as normal maintenance, is you have to add ballast. That's what they call the rock there. And they come along with the hopper car, and they fill the ballast at the top of the rails. And they go along that way, so it's nice and like that. And they come along with a tamper. And what that does, it literally lifts the rails and ties all up, compacts the rock, and it continues along the way. And that's how you raise the rails along the way. It happens normally, and it's something you have to watch out in tunnels, kind of thing. Be careful you don't raise it too high, so you don't lose your clearances, kind of thing. So then you need it, and if it gets too high, you just go in and use the undercutter, and that has like a little chain that removes ballast and cleans it of the dirt, so you just have rock, and you add more rock in. So that's how you do it. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody. Again, big hand for our presenters. Really nice job here. See you in 2 weeks.
Charles, I'm going down to Drago's mansion at midnight. There's something down there that will unravel these mysteries. I'm sure of it, and I can feel it in my bones. And Charles, why don't you meet me up there? I could use some help.
Bobby Keene has worked for Frankly Freddy's for over 25 years. When Bobby finds out this family-run business is being sold to another company, his life takes a downhill turn. Don't miss this original series starring Dmitry Chikorsky and Michael Thomas, along with a cast of Humboldt County's most loved actors. Bobby Keene Corporate World is seen only on The Carol Escobar Show, Tuesdays at 7:30 p.m. and Sundays at 6 p.m. on Access Humboldt Cable Channel 12.
Bobby Keene Corporate